A series started as an Elder Scrolls for Oblivion Killer, ended up as big as Elder Scrolls, but for very different reasons. In this review, I aim to explain what makes Soulsborne the franchise us players of 4 different ways. Some say it is its unforgiving difficulty, its game design, its lore, or its gameplay variety. Let's dive into each of these points for each single Soulsborne games with detail. Father of Soulsborne series and one of the most unique games of its time, Demon's Souls. The game starts in a mysterious, foggy area with your original character. You can make this character as beautiful, handsome looking as you want, or just make an abomination, like most of the players do. It looks medieval, grounded, but also so much different. The first enemies look like poor peasants, and they are very easy to defeat. Then you face your first boss, which is a demon, and probably your very first of many deaths. Fun fact, you cannot die in tutorial area, unless you're in the zone where the boss is present. When you die, you are sent to Nexus, a cool hub area, where you can roam a lot. I roamed around for like 15 minutes before I went to Boletoria via an archstone, which basically looks like a tombstone but has a custom design on it. Nexus looks mysterious and depressing, a somber place where only light is a greenish hue that is present in the area. Then you talk to the Black Maiden, whom is the best wife, and she talks to you about the basics of the world and lore, like where did you come from and who is the old one. I won't spend too much time explaining the 5 game areas, but I'll glance through every single area. Archstone of the Small King includes the Bolotarian Palace, a failed grand European-like kingdom with a huge castle, which has Pokemon dragons on it. It has knights as expected and knight-like bosses, except the Blob. We'll dive into the bosses soon after. This Archstone is divided into 5 parts like other main Archstones are divided into lesser Archstones. You start at an Archstone, then when you defeat a boss, you gain their Archstone as an access point, which as you can tell, this means you have very little checkpoints in the game, unlike other Dark Souls games. Archstone of the Borough Kin starts with the mine area, very claustrophobic place, painted brown with miners and their officials as enemies, and some lizards, big as bugs. Bosses start as a bug, but with a twist, and the more lower you get, you face more magma flame related bosses. You are basically an archaeologist at this point, and you find bones of ancient dragons and many more mysteries. Archstone of the Tower Queen. We start in a prison, library, and school-like place with enemies like brainsuckers and prisoners. Further down we go, we face bugs, gargoyles, which is a foreshadow, with a sewer-like place filled with blood, end up in a tower. Bosses are very different from each other, but each represents their own Archstone really well. Archstone of the Shadow Man. This Archstone contains the most interconnected places, such as ruins, which is present on an island with a very good looking pool inside the ruins, and contains enemies such as skeletons. But the bosses varies, and I can say, aside from the last boss, bosses and place their Archstone resides connect very well. Archstone of the Chieftain. Miyazaki's fetish with swamps starts with this Archstone. Every single area is disgusting, disease-filled muddy areas with enemies reflecting that sickness and repulsiveness, such as mosquitoes, rats, ticks. Bosses also reflect that part, but the last boss of this area has the most interesting dichotomy I ever seen on a boss fight. Bosses in Demon's Souls usually represents their each Archstone. Bolotera has knights and a king as bosses. Leechmonger represents the disgusting area he resides in, which being Chieftain Archstone. Maiden Asteria represents the idea of the abandonment, and good intention won't always end up positive. We can go on like that with each boss, but it will be boring. So let me get into mechanics of the bosses. Mechanically speaking, bosses are usually very gimmicky, but no boss is similar to each other. You don't fight the same boss twice in the gameplay sense. Bosses are much easier compared to other Soulsborne bosses. but their areas are usually much harder. But the area enemies, structures, and architect tell always a story. A story that is very bland at the first glance. But the more you read it, more you understand its uniqueness and well put together lore. Overall story and lore. On the first day, man was granted a soul, and with it clarity. On the second day, upon earth was planted an irrevocable poison, a soul-devouring demon. The soul helps humans and beasts to understand, comprehend the world and events. Without it, they become a husk with paranoia and untamed rage. Only thing they know is to do find souls, no matter from whom or however. When the Old One's deep, non-colored fog started to appear on the Boletaria Palace, it started to suck away the souls of the creatures that was close to it. Souls are a currency, a necessity, a reason to live and die for. The ones who consumed human souls become demons. Demons that tries to quench the thirst of the almost eldritch Old One. A thirst that won't go away. But who is the Old One, you may ask? It assumed that it was just a tree, which was corrupted by a greedy human. The greed of the human souls transformed the tree into a demon, who only wants to consume human souls. More you consume, more powerful you become. The Old One also started the sword arts, basically being magic in the game, which was frowned upon by the church, who, ironically, used miracles to heal the unfortunate. Half of the world was destroyed by the fog before a coalition of warriors lured the Old One back to slumber. Those warriors evolved to become monumentals, the Archstones. Half-living beings charged with preserving the fabric of reality. They sealed the Old One below the temple, which would later be called the Nexus, and banned the soul arts. In order to connect the surviving lands, 6 Archstones, mystic teleportation devices, were entrusted to elders of the 6 remaining lands. One went to the king of a small yet diligent land, what would become the northern kingdom of Boletaria. One went to the king of Burrows Underground. One went to the wise queen of the great ivory tower. This would become Letria. One went to the shaman of the temples worshipping Shadow Man. One went to chieftain of the lost and ill-fortunate souls. This is the valley of defilement. The last Archstone went to the great giants of the Northlands. This is the unseen land of the giants which was north of the northern kingdom of Boletaria. These Archstones all have counterparts in the Nexus, allowing easy travel between the 6 lands in the gameplay. As time passed, the Monumentals began to die off one by one. The Archstones unifying the lands were forgotten by humanity. Archstones, Boletaria Kingdom. Boletaria has become a strong kingdom with good living conditions. We start the game where King Allant the 12th is the king. Elder King Allant wanted more power, much more power than his ancestors. He wanted to become the most powerful human ever lived. Although, by studying the sword arts, he awakened the Old One, and the Old One gave Allant the power he wanted so badly. A man who seeks power couldn't handle the power that was given to him. He was deformed as a pathetic slug who couldn't even move. He had to reside in the Old One himself to use his newly gained power. Stonefang Tunnel. The deep fog spread to nearby Stonefang Tunnel. The excavators mined ore to forge weapons for King Allant. The deep fog amplified this obsessive need to mine until it began to manifest itself physically. The excavators grew scales and yellow, lizard-like eyes, now under the watchful eye of the Fat Ministers. Deep fog then touched the magma, the skeletons, and turned them into demons. Latria. The deep fog transformed the population into squid-like demons. Demons that subdued the knights and put the queen and her family into imprisonment. Then the Old One came here. With this unique situation, he thought he can experiment, and grew more powerful. He used Queen's souls to make an illusion of herself, whom is Fool's Idol. Fool's Idol taught the humans to redempt. By this redemption act, Old Monk created more and stronger demons. The Old Monk experimented on the womb to create statue-like demons. Shrine of Storms. Eventually, the Deep Folk reached the island Shrine of Storms, where sorcerers use their power over the dead to conjure malevolent spirits and reanimate the bones of the deceased Shadow Men. These skeletons arose from the caves and slaughtered or sacrificed all the men in the fort above. The Deep Folk made flesh the myth of the Educator and the Storm King. Educator gnawed on the flesh of the unworthy soldiers, and Storm King commanded the Storm Beast to attack anyone who still possessed a soul. Valley of Defilement. The Deep Folk heaped even more misery upon the valley's residents. Saint Asteria could no longer believe in a god which would be so cruel, and was transformed into an archdemon by pledging herself to a demon's soul. Through this unholy pact, she hoped to use her newfound powers to relieve the suffering of the outcasts. For this selfless compassion, she was worshipped by the valley's residents as a Christ-like figure. All the knights of the church who accompanied her, with the exception of Garvinant, attacked her after she renounced the god they worshipped, and they were all killed. But the god of the church, which Asteria was part of, believed the god without knowing the god they worshipped was the Old One itself. If you are enjoying this video, please consider subscribing, liking and sharing. It would mean a lot for me. This is my first video project ever. So yeah, thank you already. Music. Music is absent in the areas, as all Soulsborne games. But we have boss musics. Although not very professional compared to other Soulsborne, it has a unique charm on it. Old King Allant OST is excellent piece, with haunting church orc giving us the players the spooks. The remasters of this song was much more professional, but in my humble opinion, kinda lost its charm. I recommend King Allant's OST, Maiden of Astria's OST, and Tower Knight's OST. These three are my favorites and very different than other Soulsborne game musics. If I remember correctly, none of the other Soulsborne music have a group of people laughing at you. Conclusion. Demon's Souls gameplay-wise is a slower version of its Soulsborne sequels. Transportation mechanic is not needed actually, because in the lore segment we learned that the most of the archstones are actually connected to each other geographically, in some way or other. But the hub area, and the hub area being a twist itself, is a nice idea that executed really well. I find myself finding this game more similar to Dark Souls 2 than the others in the gameplay area. Healing is slow, bosses are usually much easier than the area they reside in. Rolling is fine, but risky, just like DS2, but for different reasons. Lore-wise, Demon's Souls has a simpler lore and story to comprehend. Substories of NPCs are very similar to other Soulsborne games, usually grim and somber. Boss lore is kinda detailed in some areas, but you can clearly see some bosses are much more important. Maiden Asteria still is my favorite story to this day. A maiden turned into dark side to heal the sick, only to spread a plague and cause more hardship to the people around her. Demon's Souls was an experiment proved itself to work. Sure, bosses were usually gimmicky and the game punishes you more compared to other Soulsborne titles, like word tendencies, healing items being finite, and losing half of your health in the soul form just to get it after killing the bosses. Thanks for watching. It means a lot that my first video title got uploaded to YouTube. And if you like the video, please do like. If you dislike the video, dislike. And if you have any ideas that I can do, I want to do a Soulsborne review as I told you in the title, but any other games are fine if I enjoy the games. So if you have any recommendations, please do comment. See you guys later.